Picture this. A young noble wakes up inside a novel he once abandoned halfway through, and fate hands him the most forgettable role in the entire story, the fiancé nobody wants. His plan is simple: stay quiet, stay invisible. Let the engagement collapse on its own, and slip out of the plot before it can humiliate him twice. But somewhere between a maze of rose gardens and a man who was never supposed to notice him at all, that plan falls apart completely. Because the coldest, most feared commander in the empire, the very father of the fiancé ignoring him, starts watching him like something he refuses to let walk away. What happens when the safest plan in the world wanders straight into the wrong wolf's territory? Pull up a seat and let this one unfold slowly, because not even the story's own hero saw this particular disaster of the heart coming. And if you've ever caught yourself falling for exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong time, we want to hear that story in the comments below. He would spend a great deal of time, in the weeks that followed, trying to figure out exactly how a man could go from an unremarkable apartment to a canopy bed fit for royalty without any memory of the transition in between. He never did find a satisfying answer. Eventually, he simply stopped asking and started making the most of it instead. When Elian Rosewood opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was that his skull throbbed like he'd lost a fight with a doorframe. The second thing he noticed was that he was absolutely, categorically not in his studio apartment anymore. Instead of the water-stained ceiling he'd fallen asleep under, the one with the crack shaped vaguely like Florida, he was staring up at a canopy of dark blue silk stitched with gold thread. The mattress beneath him was soft in a way that suggested it had never once heard the word clearance. Even the blanket draped over his legs probably cost more than his rent. For a few blissful seconds, he lay there entertaining the theory that he'd won the lottery and blacked out from the shock. Then the memories arrived. Not his memories. Someone else's, pouring into his skull like water into a cracked cup, and he understood with sudden, horrible clarity exactly what had happened to him. He had transmigrated. Worse, he'd transmigrated into a novel. A political fantasy romance he'd dropped somewhere around chapter 40 because the pacing made him want to throw his phone across the room. And out of every character he could have possibly become, the protagonist, the scheming duke, even a nameless tavern extra, fate had handed him the walking punchline of the entire plot. He was now Elian Rosewood, a minor noble whose sole narrative function was to be humiliated, dumped, and quietly forgotten by page 200. It was, he thought bitterly, a fittingly small role for a man who'd spent his previous life being similarly overlooked. In his old world, he'd worked a job he didn't particularly like, in an apartment he could barely afford, with a social circle that had quietly thinned out over the years until it was mostly just him, a stack of half-finished novels, and a cat that had belonged to a roommate who'd moved out without taking it. He hadn't been unhappy, exactly, just unremarkable, the kind of life that, if it ended suddenly, wouldn't leave much of a dent in the world. Which made the irony almost funny. He'd traded one forgettable existence for a role explicitly written to be forgotten. At least this time he'd get canopy beds and imported tea out of the deal. According to the borrowed memories now settling into place, Elian had been engaged since childhood to Cedric Thorncliffe, sole heir to the powerful Thorncliffe line. In the book, Cedric had spent the entire courtship in love with a noblewoman named Rosaline and treated his actual fiancée like unwanted furniture. Eventually the engagement collapsed, Elian's reputation collapsed along with it, and he vanished from the story entirely, presumably to go cry in a corner off-screen forever. The borrowed memories also supplied context he hadn't bothered to fully absorb the first time he'd read the book. The engagement wasn't romantic in origin at all. House Rosewood had once held considerable influence in the Northern Territories, and though its fortunes had faded over 2 generations, the family name still carried enough old prestige to be politically useful. House Thorncliffe, meanwhile, needed exactly that, a respectable alliance to quiet the whispers that a war hero's household lacked the softer graces of proper nobility. 2 families, 1 convenient contract, and 2 young men who'd never been consulted about any of it. It was, Elian thought, a spectacularly boring reason for an entire subplot's worth of misery. Elian sat up, crossed his arms, and made an executive decision. Absolutely not. He had 0 interest in chasing a man who didn't want him, 0 interest in tearful confrontations, and 0 interest in becoming a laughingstock for a plot he hadn't even finished reading. The original Elian had spent years throwing himself at Cedric and getting nothing but frostbite for his trouble. This new Elian had other priorities: eat well, admire attractive people from a respectful distance, and let the engagement die a natural, drama-free death. It was, he decided, a flawless plan. Several days later, the plan carried him straight to the gates of Thorncliffe Manor, and Elian immediately understood why half the servants in his borrowed memory referred to the place in hushed tones. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress that had begrudgingly agreed to also serve tea. Black stone walls rose high enough to swallow the afternoon light, iron gates loomed like they were personally offended by visitors, and armored guards stood at such rigid attention that Elian half expected one of them to salute the carriage. His fiancée greeted him at the entrance. Greeted was generous. Cedric barely looked up from whatever paperwork he'd been carrying. He was undeniably handsome in the way storybook heirs always were. Golden hair, sharp blue eyes, jaw you could cut glass with. His expression, however, suggested he'd rather be anywhere on the continent that wasn't this doorway. "Welcome to Thorncliffe Manor," Cedric said, with all the warmth of a man reciting a memorized greeting to a tax collector. "Thank you," Elian said cheerfully. "I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was fine." A nod. A silence stretched long enough to grow moss. Elian blinked. Cedric blinked back. Finally Cedric cleared his throat. "I have matters to attend to." Elian nearly cheered out loud. "Business? Wonderful, take all the time in the world." "Of course," he said, beaming. "Don't let me keep you." Cedric paused, visibly thrown by how easily his fiancé let him go. He'd braced himself for complaints, or worse, some clumsy attempt at closeness. Instead, the man looked positively delighted to be abandoned. It wasn't enough to change his plans, but it was enough to make him frown faintly as he walked away, already half convinced something about this fiancé was different from what he remembered. Elian, meanwhile, wandered off to admire the furniture and concluded, with great satisfaction, that nobility suited him just fine. The next several days passed in exactly the manner he'd hoped. Cedric stayed busy and scarce. Elian ate spectacular meals, read in the estate's enormous library, and explored gardens that seemed to multiply every time he turned a corner. Life, for the first time since his untimely death by transmigration, felt peaceful. Then he got lost, badly. In his defense, 15 gardens was an unreasonable number of gardens for any household to own. While hunting for a pond one of the maids had mentioned, Elian wandered through an unfamiliar hedge maze and stumbled into a private courtyard thick with climbing roses. And there, standing in the center with a book in one hand, was a man who had absolutely no business looking the way he looked. Elian froze mid-step. He'd expected an elderly Marcus, silver-bearded, dignified, possibly using a cane. What he got instead was a man who couldn't have been older than his mid-40s, with dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of a winter sky right before a storm. Even standing perfectly still, he radiated the kind of authority that made rooms go quiet. Elian's borrowed memories supplied the name before his brain caught up: Damien Thorncliffe, the Iron Wolf of the North, hero of 3 border wars. One of the most feared men in the Empire, whose name alone reportedly made hardened generals reconsider their life choices. Nobody had mentioned he looked like this. Frankly, Elian felt personally deceived by the source material. The Marcus arched an eyebrow. "And who might you be?" Elian nearly jumped out of his skin. "My apologies, my lord. I appear to be lost." "You are indeed lost. In my private gardens." "To be fair," Elian said, recovering his composure, "I only get lost in the expensive ones." Silence. Then, to the shock of absolutely everyone within earshot, the terrifying Iron Wolf of the North laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and 2 nearby servants nearly dropped their trays. Their master had laughed, actually laughed. "You're an interesting young man," Damien said, closing his book. "I do try," Elian replied, still slightly stunned that he was alive. "Allow me to walk you back before you find a second garden to get lost in." As they walked, Damien discovered, with some surprise, that his son's fiancée talked considerably more than expected, narrated getting lost like an epic betrayal orchestrated by the estate's mapmakers, and had opinions about flowers that bordered on philosophical. For a man used to silence since his wife's passing, it was oddly, dangerously entertaining. At one point, Elian grabbed his sleeve to point at a butterfly. "Look at that!" The watching servants nearly had heart attacks. Nobody touched the Marcus. Nobody. Damien glanced at the butterfly, unbothered. "It's blue. Matches your eyes." Both of them stopped walking, Elian froze. A servant somewhere audibly stopped breathing. Had Damien just accidentally flirted? So it does, Damien said mildly, and kept walking as though he hadn't just short-circuited half the estate staff. Behind them, one of the younger maids grabbed the sleeve of an older housemaid and mouth wide-eyed, did that just happen? The older maid, who had served the household for over a decade, and had never once seen her employer offer an unprompted compliment to anyone, simply nodded slowly, as though witnessing a rare astronomical event that wouldn't repeat for another century. Neither of them said a word to anyone else that day, mostly because neither of them quite trusted their own account of what they'd just seen. Elian mentally slapped himself. Note to self, stop complimenting attractive older men on reflex. It was becoming a liability. It became something of an unspoken arrangement after that. Damien taught him archery, and in exchange, Elian taught Damien things no Marcus of this world had any business learning. It started, as most of Elian's terrible ideas did, with boredom. Rain had kept them both indoors for 2 days straight, and by the third afternoon, Elian had run out of books that held his attention, and Damien had run out of patience for paperwork. "I'm going to teach you a card game," Elian announced. Producing a hand-drawn deck, he'd bullied one of the maids into helping him make from blank cards and a pot of ink. Damien eyed the deck with the same suspicion he might have shown an unfamiliar diplomat. "Is this a trick? It's called bullshit. That's genuinely the name, I didn't make it up. That seems like an inauspicious name for a game. You'll understand once you play it." 2 hours later, the head butler walked in to find the Iron Wolf of the North, feared conqueror, terror of 3 border provinces, glaring at a hand of cards with the deadly focus he usually reserved for battlefield strategy, while Elian cackled from across the table, having just successfully convinced him that a pair of 3s was in fact a full house. "You lied to me," Damien said, sounding genuinely wounded. "That's the entire point of the game, my lord. This is a terrible game. You've asked to play 4 more rounds. I would like to reclaim my losses." By the end of the week, Damien had not only mastered the game, but had started applying an unsettling level of tactical thinking to it, to the point that Elian began to suspect he was being hustled by a man who'd once outmaneuvered entire armies. It became a quiet ritual between them, an hour most evenings, cards spread across whatever table was nearest, Damien's carefully composed expression cracking every time Elian managed to catch him in a lie. It was, Elian would later admit to no one of his favorite parts of the entire day. There was something disarming about watching a man so universally feared reduced to mild indignation over a card game, something that made the distance between terrifying war hero and person collapse a little more each time. Cedric, walking in on one such evening, stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of his father triumphantly slamming down a card and declaring, with the gravity of a military victory, 2 kings. "That's your 3rd lie this round," Elian said, delighted. "I am improving." Cedric quietly backed out of the room without either of them noticing and went to go lie down for a while, because apparently this was simply his life now. The pattern started small enough that Elian didn't notice it right away. Whenever he ate breakfast alone, Damien somehow materialized at the table across from him. Whenever he visited the library, the Marcus happened to already be there, reading something he could easily have read in his own study. Whenever Elian wandered the gardens admiring the roses, Damien was, inexplicably, also admiring the roses in that exact garden at that exact hour. By the 3rd coincidence, Elian assumed it was bad luck. By the 10th, even he, a man not known for his powers of observation, started to wonder. He shrugged it off eventually. The Marcus was probably lonely. A man that intimidating likely didn't have many people willing to sit with him voluntarily, and Elian, having nothing better to do, was happy to provide company. One evening over tea, he mentioned offhandedly that he'd always wanted to learn archery back in his old life. Not that he could explain that part, but had never gotten around to it. The next morning, a beautifully crafted bow was waiting outside his door, along with a note in tight, elegant handwriting. "If you are serious, meet me after breakfast, Damien." Elian stared at the note, then stared harder. The Iron Wolf of the North was going to personally teach him archery. Several maids reportedly locked themselves in a supply closet to scream into towels. The knights on duty started a quiet betting pool on how long it would take before their famously impatient lord snapped at his student and stormed off. They lost that bet spectacularly. No, your elbow's too low, Damien said, adjusting his stance with more patience than anyone had ever seen him display toward a training recruit. Like this. No, like this. You're currently threatening the sky. The sky started it, Elian said. Damien pressed 2 fingers to his temple, and the watching knights braced for an explosion. Instead, he simply sighed and moved behind Elian, gently correcting his posture with careful hands. Elian went stiff, not from discomfort, but because the man smelled, unfairly, like cedar and rain. Several knights nearby looked ready to faint. Their lord was touching someone, personally, voluntarily. When Elian finally hit the target dead center, he celebrated like he'd single-handedly conquered a small country. I did it, Damien actually smiled, a real one, not the thin diplomatic curve he wore in court. Well done. The praise made Elian glow with pride, and that smile of his nearly blinded 3 separate servants who'd worked at the estate for over a decade and had never once seen their lord smile twice in the same week. Around Elian, apparently, the impossible had become routine. Cedric, for his part, remained completely oblivious to all of it. Whenever he asked staff where his fiancée had gone, the answer was always some variation of, young Master Elian is with Lord Damien, archery with Lord Damien, tea with Lord Damien, a walk with Lord Damien. Cedric assumed nothing of it. His father was a reserved man who rarely bothered with anyone, so surely this was harmless. He would come to deeply regret that assumption. It didn't take long for the household staff to form an unofficial intelligence network dedicated entirely to observing their master's downfall. Publicly, they called themselves the Rose Appreciation Society, in honor of the garden where Lord Damien and young Master Elian most frequently crossed paths. Privately, among themselves, they simply called it witness duty. Every week brought fresh evidence for the ledger the head housemaid had started keeping in a locked drawer. Lord Damien had begun choosing his coats more carefully. Lord Damien had started arriving early to meals he used to skip entirely. Lord Damien had, on no fewer than 4 separate occasions, been caught smiling at nothing, at his tea, at a letter, once memorably at a rosebush that had done nothing to deserve it. The butler, a man who had served the family for 30 unshakable years, nearly wept openly the day he found his employer standing outside the kitchen at an odd hour. "My lord, may I ask why you're here? I heard Elian wanted strawberry tart. So the cooks are making strawberry tart, yes. You came to personally oversee that, naturally." The butler excused himself to go stare into the middle distance for a while. It reached a fever pitch one afternoon when Elian, exhausted from a full day of exploring, fell asleep in the library, with a book open on his chest and his hair falling messily across his face. Damien entered to retrieve a document, saw him there, and simply stopped. He didn't retrieve the document. Instead, without a hint of hesitation, he removed his own coat and draped it gently over the sleeping young man, then carefully adjusted his head against the arm of the sofa so his neck wouldn't ache later. The butler, who had followed him in out of habit, witnessed the entire thing from the doorway and made a silent, solemn decision that his future grandchildren deserved to hear this story in full, unedited detail. Their lord had become hopeless, utterly, thoroughly hopeless. Damien, to his credit, remained in complete denial for weeks. He told himself these were simple courtesies. Buying rare books was hospitality. Ensuring desserts were prepared was basic manners. And personally carrying an injured guest through half the estate after a twisted ankle was, obviously, just what any responsible host would do. "My lord," the butler had ventured cautiously during that particular incident, "perhaps one of the knights could assist young Master Elian instead." Damien looked genuinely offended. "He's injured. Yes, my lord, but he shouldn't walk on it. Therefore, I will carry him." The butler nearly sat down on the floor right there. This was the same man who had once finished directing a military retreat with an arrow still lodged in his shoulder. A mildly swollen ankle had reduced him to an overprotective mother hen. Elian, blissfully unaware of the psychological damage he was inflicting on the entire household, simply apologized for the trouble and let himself be carried, admiring the ceiling tile work the whole way. It happened on a sleepless night, after hours of staring at the ceiling like a man awaiting his own execution. Damien Thorncliffe, survivor of 3 wars, veteran of countless assassination attempts, a man who had once negotiated a treaty with a knife wound still bleeding under his sleeve, finally admitted a truth he had spent weeks trying to outrun. He was in love, hopelessly, ridiculously, irrevocably, and the person occupying every quiet corner of his mind was his own son's fiancée. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the way he might before walking into a losing battle. After surviving actual warfare, political conspiracies, and at least 2 separate poisoning attempts, he had finally met an opponent he could not defeat, his own heart, which had apparently decided to aim itself at the single most inconvenient target available in the entire empire. If anyone had told the knights of Thorncliffe Manor that their fearsome commander would spend half his nights interrogating his own feelings like a love-struck teenager, they would have laughed themselves into the infirmary. Unfortunately, reality was rarely that merciful. For the first few days after accepting the truth, Damien tried to convince himself the feeling would simply fade. He was a grown man with decades of self-discipline. Surely this was some passing foolishness that time would erase. Instead, it got worse. Mornings felt unbearably quiet when Elian wasn't at the table. Meals lost their appeal without someone nearby narrating increasingly implausible stories about geese from a past life he refused to elaborate on. Even reading became a struggle, because his thoughts kept drifting toward a particular bright, easy laugh. Worst of all, he'd started smiling, at nothing. Constantly, my lord, the butler said carefully one morning, watching his employer grin faintly into a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Are you feeling unwell? No. A fever, perhaps? No. Shall I summon the physician? Damien frowned. Why would you do that? Because you have been smiling at your tea for 3 full minutes, my lord. Damien set the cup down immediately, jaw tightening. The butler nearly cried on the spot. Their master had it bad. Meanwhile, Elian remained gloriously oblivious, treating the entire estate like his personal paradise. Cedric left him alone, which suited him fine, and Damien kept appearing whenever loneliness threatened to set in. A coincidence so consistent that Elian had half convinced himself the Marquess possessed some kind of supernatural loneliness-detecting ability. He sighed wistfully in the garden one afternoon. I could really go for strawberry tarts right now. 3 hours later, strawberry tarts appeared. He complained, another day, about a rare botanical text being impossible to find anywhere in the capital. The next morning it sat on his desk, spine uncracked, clearly acquired at considerable expense and effort. He stared at it for a long moment. Had books started reproducing on their own? Elsewhere, the head butler quietly supervised Damien, personally instructing staff on the correct humidity level for storing rare books, because young Master Elian liked to read, and the same man who had once terrified entire universities into silence was now fussing over shelf conditions like a museum curator. Love, the entire household agreed privately, was a genuinely terrifying force of nature. The first real complication arrived roughly 2 months into Elian's stay, in the form of an invitation none of them had asked for. Baron Percival Ashgrove was, by every noble metric that mattered, an excellent match. Young, wealthy, moderately handsome, and possessed of a smile that had charmed half the ballrooms in the capital. He also happened to be a distant cousin of the crown and, more importantly to the plot of Elian's Borrowed Memories, someone the original novel had mentioned exactly once, in a single throwaway line about political marriages. Elian had assumed that meant the man was irrelevant. He assumed wrong. Ashgrove arrived at Thorncliffe Manor under the polite pretense of renewing an old family acquaintance, took one look at Elian across the drawing room, and decided, with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no, that a broken engagement to a Thorncliffe heir was practically an open invitation. I understand your engagement to Lord Cedric has grown complicated, Ashgrove said smoothly over dinner, ignoring the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. It would be no trouble at all to arrange something more suitable. My family has considerable influence at court. Elian, mid-bite of roast pheasant, blinked. That's very forward of you. I find forwardness saves everyone a great deal of time. Across the table, Cedric said nothing, mostly because he'd stopped paying attention to his fiancée's romantic prospects months ago and honestly hadn't registered the conversation as anything worth his input. It was Damien who set down his fork with a quiet, deliberate click that somehow carried more menace than an actual weapon being drawn. Baron Ashgrove, he said, in a tone that made 2 servants near the door instinctively step backward. Young Master Elian's engagement, while under review, has not yet been dissolved. I would advise patience. Ashgrove smiled, unbothered. Either brave or foolish, the staff couldn't decide which. Of course, my lord. I only meant to express interest for the future. Noted, Damien said, in a voice that suggested the future in question would not be arriving. After dinner, the household staff convened an emergency session of the Rose Appreciation Society. Their master had never, not once in living memory, interrupted a dinner conversation over a matter that wasn't political or military. He had just done so over a stranger being polite to Elian. The butler updated the ledger with trembling hands. Possessive behavior confirmed. Subject in critical condition. Ashgrove, to his credit, did not take the hint easily. He returned twice more over the following weeks. Each visit met with an increasingly thin veneer of hospitality from Damien, who found excuses to be present at every single one, a level of scheduling gymnastics that even Cedric found faintly suspicious, though he still hadn't connected the dots. Elian, for his part, found the entire situation baffling. He had no interest in Ashgrove whatsoever. The Baron's confidence read less as charming and more as a man who'd never had to work for anything in his life. But he couldn't quite explain why Damien's jaw tightened every time the Baron so much as complimented his sleeve embroidery. It would be several more weeks before Elian understood exactly what he'd witnessed. By then, the damage, if it could even be called that, had already been done. It started with small things Cedric couldn't quite name. Whenever he asked where his fiancé had gone, the answer was always some variation of the same sentence. Young Master Elian is with Lord Damien, breakfast with Lord Damien, horseback riding with Lord Damien, archery, reading, evening walks. Somehow, impossibly, all of it involved Lord Damien. At some point Cedric began to wonder, half-jokingly, whether his father had quietly adopted a second son without telling anyone. Then came the smiling. His father had smiled more in the past 2 months than in the previous 10 years combined. He listened patiently to Elian's increasingly absurd anecdotes. He indulged requests he would have dismissed instantly from anyone else. He had, on at least one confirmed occasion, actually laughed out loud, in front of witnesses. The final piece of evidence arrived the day Cedric witnessed his fiancée scold his father over lunch. "My lord, you skipped lunch again," Elian said, arms crossed, sounding for all the world like an exasperated spouse. "I was occupied," Damien replied. "No excuses, very well." Cedric stood frozen in the doorway. His father had complied, without argument. A war hero who had once made a visiting foreign delegation apologize for arriving 3 minutes late was now meekly accepting a scolding from a man 20 years his junior over a missed meal. Something in Cedric went cold. Something was very, very wrong, and he couldn't yet name what. Then Ashgrove's visits happened, and his father's uncharacteristic, hovering during dinner registered as strange in a way Cedric couldn't immediately dismiss. Still, he told himself it was nothing. His father was simply protective of a guest under his roof. That was reasonable. That was normal. He tried once to raise the subject directly, carefully, the way one might approach a sleeping guard dog. "Father," he said one evening over dinner, "you've seemed different lately." Damien didn't look up from his plate. Different how? Lighter, maybe. "I don't know. You laugh now. Is that a complaint?" "No," Cedric said too quickly. "Just an observation." Damien's expression gave away nothing, which Cedric had long ago learned meant there was, in fact, something to give away. "People change," his father said simply, and returned to his meal as though that settled the matter entirely. It did not settle the matter. If anything, it only deepened the unease sitting quietly in Cedric's chest. The sense that everyone around him seemed to be in on some joke he hadn't been told the punchline to yet. He let it go for the moment, telling himself that whatever it was probably harmless. Fate, unfortunately, had already decided the truth would reveal itself, whether Cedric was ready or not. The final blow landed on an ordinary afternoon, when Cedric wandered into the library looking for a history text, and instead found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elian had fallen asleep on the sofa, a book resting crookedly on his chest, loose strands of hair falling over his closed eyes. Nothing unusual there. Elian fell asleep reading at least twice a week. What stopped Cedric cold was his father, seated in the armchair beside him, not reading, not writing, not moving at all, just watching. It wasn't the expression of a guardian. It wasn't fatherly concern, or idle boredom, or anything Cedric had a category for. It was the unmistakable, unguarded look of a man who was completely, hopelessly in love. The kind of look Cedric had only ever seen once before, in an old portrait of his parents from before his mother had passed. The book in Cedric's hands hit the floor. Damien looked up, entirely composed. Cedric stared, mouth opening and closing without producing a single word. Elian, mercifully or unmercifully, chose that exact moment to wake up, blinking blearily at both of them. "Why is everyone staring at me?" he mumbled. Cedric raised a shaking finger, pointing directly at his own father. "Why?" he said, voice climbing several octaves. "Are you looking at my fiancé like you want to marry him?" Silence fell over the library like a physical weight. Outside the door, the butler stopped breathing entirely. A maid carrying a tea tray nearly dropped it, and Elian, still half asleep, rubbed his eyes and asked, with genuinely no idea what he'd walked into, "Wait, who's getting married?" Cedric buried his face in both hands. "Please tell me I'm hallucinating." Elian looked between them, Cedric mortified, Damien unnervingly calm, and burst out laughing. Certain this had to be some elaborate joke, nobody laughed with him. The smile died on his face. "Wait." He looked at Cedric again, then at Damien, then back at Cedric, dawning horror creeping across his features. "You're not joking." Cedric dropped his hands and pointed, with the dramatic flair of a man delivering a verdict, straight at his father. "He's in love with you." Elian blinked. "Who? My father? Who? My father? Him?" "Yes." Slowly, Elian turned to face Damien, who sat with unnerving composure, though a faint tension had crept into his eyes, the closest thing to nervousness Elian had ever seen on him. "You like someone," Elian said carefully. "Yes, it's you. I thought you liked some noble lady. I told you she was fortunate. I never said fortunate in the way you assumed. You gave me relationship advice, because you asked." All the color drained from Elian's face, then rushed back with alarming speed, pale, then red, then a shade of crimson that suggested his soul had briefly left his body. He collapsed face first into the nearest sofa cushion. "I would like to transmigrate again, please. I support this fully," Cedric said immediately, dropping into the nearest chair like his legs had simply given out. What none of them expected was what happened next. Damien rose quietly from his seat. Elian lifted his head. Cedric stared, still too shell-shocked to process much of anything. "I apologize," Damien said. The room went very still. In Cedric's 24 years of life, he could count his father's apologies on one hand, and most of those had been for minor military miscalculations, not personal matters. Damien's expression remained composed, but his voice carried something quieter underneath, real, uncomfortable regret. "My feelings are my own to carry. I never intended for either of you to bear the weight of them." Elian blinked. Cedric blinked harder. Then the Marquis inclined his head, not quite a bow, but close enough that both young men's jaws dropped in unison. "If my behavior has caused either of you discomfort, I ask your forgiveness." Cedric's jaw very nearly hit the floor. His father, the Iron Wolf of the North, feared across 3 provinces, had just apologized and bowed his head, in the same conversation, to 2 people half his age. "My lord, please, there's no need." Elian started, sitting up straight, flustered. Damien offered a faint, almost self-deprecating smile. "Young men shouldn't have to carry the burden of an old man's foolishness, Elian said, nearly shouting. "You look younger than half the noblemen at court." Meanwhile, Cedric was quietly experiencing an entirely separate crisis of his own, because as absurd and overwhelming as the whole scene was, one truth had become painfully, unavoidably obvious to him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't jealous. He wasn't even particularly heartbroken. He was, more than anything, deeply relieved, and that realization terrified him more than the original revelation had, because it meant he had never actually loved Elian. Not really. Not in the way an engagement was supposed to mean something. Their arrangement had always been political, a box checked off by 2 families with land to consolidate, and Elian had never once tried to force affection where none existed. If anything, Elian had always seemed happier around his father than around him. That realization sat strangely in his chest for the rest of the evening. 3 days later, Cedric knocked on Elian's door, carrying 2 bottles of wine and the expression of a man walking into his own eulogy. Elian sat up immediately. "Why do you look like you're attending your own funeral?" "Let's talk," Cedric said, and dropped onto the nearest chair. Several hours, 1 empty bottle, and a truly alarming number of snacks later, the 2 of them sat side by side, laughing at the sheer absurdity of the past few months. "I never actually wanted to win your affection," Elian admitted, considerably looser, after 2 glasses of wine. "I just wanted you to leave me alone so I could enjoy the free food." Cedric nearly choked. "I did leave you alone. I thought that's what you wanted." "It was. But I also thought you wanted space, so I gave you space, and then somehow your father filled that space instead." Please don't finish that sentence. Not like that, I meant. I know what you meant. Please still don't finish it. Both of them dissolved into laughter, the kind that came from months of accumulated tension finally breaking. When it faded, they looked at each other with the same realization dawning at the same moment. We could have solved this months ago, Cedric said. Months ago, Elian agreed. By the end of the evening, they'd reached a mutual wine-assisted conclusion. Neither of them wanted the engagement, and neither of them wanted to become enemies over something that had never been their choice in the first place. They shook hands on it, laughing, and the servants listening outside the door. Because of course they were listening, very nearly applauded out loud. Peace, at long last. Blessed, uncomplicated peace. The official cancellation of the engagement was announced 1 month later, and the capital's noble society did exactly what noble society did best. It lost its collective mind. Rumors spread through the ballrooms faster than actual news ever could. The most popular version claimed Marquess Damien Thorncliffe had personally challenged his own son for a beautiful young noble's hand, sword drawn, honor at stake. A slightly less dramatic version insisted father and son had come to blows over a forbidden love triangle. One particularly imaginative baroness swore up and down that Elian possessed some kind of magical charm capable of ensnaring entire bloodlines, one Thorncliffe at a time. The emperor, upon hearing the gossip secondhand, reportedly laughed for a solid 10 minutes before composing himself enough to ask whether it was actually true. At the center of the storm, however, life had become surprisingly calm. Elian and Cedric, freed from the pressure of an engagement neither of them had wanted, discovered they genuinely liked each other's company, as friends, without the weight of expectation hanging over every interaction. Cedric's new problem, unfortunately, was his father. Once the engagement officially ended, Damien made no grand declarations, no dramatic pursuit. He simply continued being himself, patient, quiet, and utterly, hopelessly embarrassing in the way he cared for Elian without ever announcing it. Winter arrived, and a new cloak mysteriously appeared in Elian's wardrobe. Elian admired a particular variety of rose once, and by the following week the gardens had been quietly rearranged to include an entire new bed of them. He complained once about cold mornings, and heated stones began appearing under his blankets before he even woke. It was done so seamlessly that Elian often didn't notice at all. Cedric noticed. The servants noticed. At this point, the horses probably noticed. One afternoon, Cedric caught his father lingering outside the kitchen for no obvious reason, and felt a distinct sense of déjà vu, given that he'd walked in on the exact same scene, minus the strawberry tarts, several months earlier. Father, why exactly are you here? Please don't tell me this is the tart situation all over again. It's pie this time. Elian mentioned missing the berry pie from his hometown. So the kitchen is making berry pie. Yes, you came to personally supervise this. Again. Naturally. Standards have not lowered simply because the pastry changed. Cedric covered his face with both hands and walked away without another word. Some men, he decided, were simply beyond saving, and his father had clearly graduated to a permanent incurable case. Baron Ashgrove, it turned out, did not take rejection gracefully, mostly because he had never actually received one directly. Damien's vague warnings at dinner had been polite enough that Ashgrove convinced himself they were simply formalities, obstacles to route around rather than genuine refusals. So he tried again. Louder, this time. The occasion was the Autumn Gala, one of the few events large enough that even a reclusive Marquess couldn't avoid attending without causing a diplomatic incident. Elian, freshly disentangled from his engagement, and blissfully unaware that half the capital considered him the most interesting scandal of the season, had come along mostly for the free food. He should have known better. Ashgrove found him within the first 20 minutes, resplendent in a coat clearly tailored for maximum visibility, and did not bother with subtlety. Lord Elian, he said, loudly enough for the surrounding cluster of nobles to hear, now that you're free of your unfortunate engagement, I'd like to formally announce my intentions to court you. My family would be honored to. That's very kind, Elian said, already backing up half a step. But I'm really not looking to. Nonsense. A man of your charm shouldn't remain unattached for long, and I can offer considerably more security than a broken engagement to a family currently drowning in gossip. The surrounding nobles' fans stilled mid-flutter. Someone gasped audibly. It was, by any measure, a spectacularly rude thing to say in public, and Ashgrove seemed to realize it a half-second too late, Right around the moment a shadow fell over both of them. Baron Ashgrove. Damien's voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The temperature of the entire ballroom seemed to drop several degrees regardless, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. "Lord Thorncliffe," Ashgrove said, recovering admirably fast for a man who'd just gone visibly pale. "I was merely expressing interest in. You were insulting a family under my protection, in public, at an event I personally sponsored." Damien's tone remained perfectly even, which somehow made it worse. "I believe I asked for patience regarding Elian's future some months ago. I did not ask for a public spectacle. My lord, surely you understand a man's eagerness to secure a good match. I understand ambition. I understand less why you believed insulting him would be the way to achieve it." Damien stepped, quite deliberately, into the small space between Ashgrove and Elian, not quite a threat, but close enough that the message required no translation. Elian's future is his own to decide. It is not, and will never be, a prize to be claimed by whoever announces it loudest at a party. The room, by now thoroughly riveted, watched Ashgrove's jaw work silently for several seconds before he managed a stiff bow. "Of course. My apologies, Lord Elian. I clearly misjudged the situation." He retreated with as much dignity as he could salvage, which wasn't much, and the story of his very public dressing down by the Iron Wolf of the North spread through the capital faster than the original engagement scandal ever had. Nobody approached Elian with unsolicited proposals for the remainder of the season. Elian, once the crowd's attention had thoroughly moved on, turned to Damien with an expression somewhere between grateful and deeply suspicious. "You didn't have to do that." "I disagree. You looked like you wanted to challenge him to a duel." "The thought crossed my mind," Damien admitted, with a calm that Elian was beginning to suspect hid something considerably less calm underneath. "I decided against it. Duels draw unnecessary attention, so instead you just publicly humiliated him. That drew attention too, but it was targeted attention." Elian laughed despite himself, and if Damien's expression softened at the sound of it, well, nobody watching was foolish enough to point it out to his face. That night, back at the estate, the Rose Appreciation Society updated their ledger with the most dramatic entry yet. "Subject has now defended young Master Elian's honor in public. Condition terminal." While his father's romantic disaster unfolded in slow, agonizing motion, Cedric had a slower reckoning of his own to face, one that had nothing to do with Elian at all. For years he'd carried a quiet, patient devotion to Lady Rosaline Beaumont, a woman who treated him with the same affection she might extend to a particularly loyal family dog. He'd told himself it was simply a matter of time, that persistence would eventually win her over, the way it always seemed to in the stories he'd grown up reading. It took watching his own father openly pursue happiness without shame for Cedric to finally ask himself an uncomfortable question. Was he actually in love with Rosaline, or was he just in love with the idea of finally succeeding at something that had always felt slightly out of reach? He found his answer at, of all places, the same autumn gala where his father had verbally dismantled Baron Ashgrove. Rosaline approached him afterward, visibly impressed by the spectacle, and said, with more warmth than she'd ever directed at him personally, "Goodness, your father is terrifying. I almost feel sorry for the Baron." "He's protective," Cedric said. "It's rather romantic, honestly. I do wonder what it's like to have someone care that fiercely." She sighed, glancing toward a cluster of other nobles across the room. Specifically, Cedric noted, toward a young cavalry captain who'd been trailing after her all evening, with far more success than Cedric had ever managed in years of trying. "Do you think Captain Aldrich would think so too?" And there it was, confirmation of something Cedric had half suspected for a long time and never let himself fully examine. Rosaline had never seen him as anything more than pleasant company. He'd spent years chasing a door that had simply never been open. Strangely, the realization didn't hurt as much as he'd expected. If anything, it felt like setting down a bag he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten how heavy it was. "I think," he said, surprising himself with how easy the words came, "that you should ask him yourself instead of asking me." Rosaline blinked, then laughed. A real laugh, not the polite social one she usually gave him. "You know, Cedric, that might be the most useful thing you've ever said to me." He watched her walk away toward the captain without a single twinge of jealousy, and understood, finally, that whatever he'd felt for her all those years had been more habit than heart. It was, in its own strange way, freeing, One more weight lifted in a year that had already upended everything he thought he knew about his own family. He found Eliane later that evening by the refreshment table, nursing a glass of punch and watching the crowd with open amusement. "You look suspiciously at peace," Eliane observed. "I think I finally got over her," Cedric admitted. "Rosaline, Rosaline." Eliane raised his glass in solemn toast. "To getting over people who were never going to love us back." Cedric clinked his glass against it, and for the first time since this entire strange, upended year had begun, felt something settle into place. "To that," he agreed. "And to whoever's foolish enough to fall for me next, God help them." "God help all of us," Eliane said, glancing meaningfully across the room to where Damien stood, still radiating quiet menace at anyone who dared glance too long in Eliane's direction. "This family runs deep with dramatics." Months passed, and somewhere in the middle of all that quiet, ordinary kindness, Eliane found himself changing without noticing it happen. At first he'd viewed Damien as the world's most impressive father-in-law, that almost was, then gradually as a friend. Then, without any clear turning point he could identify, as someone precious, someone whose calm voice settled something in his chest, whose rare smiles felt like small personal victories, whose endless patience made him feel cared for in a way he'd genuinely never experienced before, not even in his old life. The full realization hit him, of all places, in the middle of another archery lesson. He'd finally landed a perfect shot dead center, and when he turned to celebrate, Damien was already smiling at him, proud, warm, unguarded in a way he rarely allowed himself to be with anyone. "Excellent," Damien said. Eliane's whole body went still. His heart did something complicated and unauthorized in his chest. His ears went hot. "Oh no," he thought, with the dawning horror of a man watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. "Oh no, no, no." He liked older men. He liked handsome older men. He liked handsome older men who spoiled him rotten without ever asking for anything in return. He was, in every sense of the word, doomed. For an entire week, Eliane avoided Damien with the dedication of a man dodging a debt collector. He took his meals early. He rerouted his garden walks. He suddenly developed a passionate interest in a wing of the library Damien never visited. The Marquess suffered. The servants suffered secondhand, watching their lord mope through the halls like a kicked puppy. Even Cedric, watching from the sidelines, suffered, mostly from secondhand embarrassment. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Eliane marched himself directly to the training grounds one morning, jaw set with the particular determination of someone about to do something extremely stupid on purpose. Damien looked up immediately, and something in his expression eased with visible relief. "Eliane." Eliane cleared his throat, face already turning pink. "If I said I liked older men." The arrow in Damien's hands snapped clean in half. "And if I said I preferred handsome older men?" A second arrow met the same fate. "And if I said I especially liked men who spoil me rotten and never ask for anything back?" The knights training nearby witnessed something none of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. The mighty Iron Wolf of the North looking, for one brief and terrifying moment, like he might actually faint. Eliane smiled, nervous but determined. "Would you consider courting me?" For the first time in decades, Damien Thorncliffe went completely, utterly silent. 30 seconds passed, then 60. One of the younger knights whispered, "Is he dead?" and got smacked upside the head by the butler, who had somehow appeared out of nowhere specifically to witness this moment. Finally, Damien spoke, voice rough. "Truly?" Eliane laughed, soft and a little shaky. "Truly." The next instant, Damien crossed the distance between them and pulled him into an embrace so sudden that half the watching knights nearly cheered out loud. His usually composed expression had cracked entirely, replaced by something that looked, for the first time anyone present could remember, like pure, unguarded happiness. Cedric, unfortunately, witnessed the entire thing from the training yard entrance. He closed his eyes, tilted his head toward the sky, and said, with great feeling, "Mother, wherever you are, please come collect father. He has become genuinely unbearable." Elsewhere on the training grounds, the knights who had once run a betting pool on how long Damien's patience would last during archery lessons hurriedly settled an entirely different wager, this one on how long it would take their lord to actually propose. The knight who'd guessed, before the year is out, collected an embarrassing sum of coin from his comrades that evening, and made a point of buying everyone a round of ale in celebration, partly out of generosity, and partly because watching his notoriously stoic commander get flustered in public had been worth every coin wagered. The head butler, informed of the betting pool's resolution secondhand, simply added one final line to his own private ledger. Even the knights saw it coming before he did. Case remains open pending formal engagement. News that the Iron Wolf of the North was formally courting someone spread through the capital roughly as fast as news that he'd smiled in public, which was to say, immediately and with considerable embellishment along the way. The court, predictably, had opinions. Several dowager duchesses declared it scandalous. Several more declared it the most interesting thing to happen to noble society in a decade and demanded front-row seats to whatever unfolded next. The emperor, upon receiving the official notice, reportedly remarked that he'd pay good money to have seen Ashgrove's face when he heard. None of it mattered much to the two people actually involved. Damien, it turned out, courted with the same unshakable thoroughness he applied to everything else in his life, which meant Elian found himself on the receiving end of a level of devoted attention that bordered on the ridiculous. Flowers appeared with such regularity that Elian eventually asked the head gardener, only half joking, whether the estate had simply run out of roses to plant elsewhere. "My lord's orders," the gardener said solemnly. "We are, in fact, running low." There were quieter gestures too, the kind that meant more if Elian was honest with himself. Damien remembered, without being told twice, exactly how he liked his tea. He learned, without ever making it awkward, which topics of conversation Elian avoided, because they edged too close to memories of a life nobody else in this world would ever understand. And on the nights when the weight of being a stranger wearing someone else's borrowed existence became too heavy to carry alone, Damien simply sat with him in silence, asking nothing, offering steady presence instead. "You don't have to fix everything for me," Elian told him once during one of those quiet evenings. "I'm not trying to fix you," Damien said. "I'm trying to make sure you don't have to carry it by yourself." Elian hadn't had a response for that. He'd simply leaned his head against Damien's shoulder and let the silence do the talking, instead. Cedric, for his part, adjusted to the new family dynamic with the long-suffering patience of a man who had clearly decided complaining about it accomplished nothing. He and Elian remained closer, if anything, now that neither of them had to perform an engagement neither of them wanted. Cedric took to referring to Elian, half-mockingly, as his future stepfather's fiancé, a title that made Elian choke on his drink every single time it came up. "You do realize how strange that sounds," Elian said one afternoon. "I do," Cedric agreed cheerfully. "That's exactly why I keep saying it." The proposal, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, which suited both of them better than any grand gesture could have. It happened in the same rose garden where they'd first properly met. Nearly a year to the day after, Elian had wandered in lost, and found the most feared man in the Empire reading quietly among the flowers. "You realize," Elian said, watching Damien kneel with a small velvet box in hand, "that this is the exact garden where you accidentally flirted with me over a butterfly." "I'm aware," Damien said. "I chose it deliberately. You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" "Since roughly the third week I knew you," Damien admitted, which startled a laugh out of Elian even as his eyes went suspiciously bright. "I've had considerable time to prepare. That's either very romantic or slightly unsettling. I've been told it's both." Elian said yes before Damien had even finished the question, which meant the actual proposal ended in laughter rather than tears. Though the tears arrived shortly after anyway, from both of them, much to the deep satisfaction of the Rose Appreciation Society, who had been watching from a discreet distance the entire time and considered the moment the crowning achievement of their entire surveillance career. Not everything about that year was fluff and stolen strawberry tarts. There was one conversation, quieter than the rest, that mattered more than either Cedric or Damien ever discussed openly again. It happened a few weeks after the proposal, on an evening when Cedric found his father alone in the study, staring at an old portrait of his mother that usually stayed tucked away in a drawer rather than displayed. "You don't have to hide her away on my account," Cedric said, settling into the chair across from him. "I know loving Elian doesn't erase what you had with her." Damien was quiet for a long moment. "I worried, for a while, that moving forward meant leaving her behind. That caring for someone else so completely would mean she mattered less, somehow, in the end. Does it feel that way?" "No." Damien set the portrait down gently, facing outward instead of hidden. "It feels like there was simply room I didn't know I had left. She would have liked him, I think." She always did prefer people who talked too much and refused to be intimidated by me. Cedric huffed a quiet laugh. That does sound like Elian. I know this past year has been strange for you, Damien added, more carefully now, the closest thing to vulnerability Cedric had ever heard in his father's voice. Your fiancé becoming your stepfather is not a situation most sons are prepared for. It's the strangest thing that's ever happened to this family, and we once survived an actual siege. Cedric considered his next words carefully. But I meant what I said at the wedding. I'm glad. You've been happier this year than I can remember you being in the last 10 combined. I'd rather have an unconventional family that's actually happy than a conventional one, where everyone's just quietly enduring each other. Damien looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his usually composed features. Your mother would be proud of the man you've become. Kinder than I ever gave myself credit for raising. Cedric, who had not expected to end this particular conversation fighting back tears, cleared his throat and reached for the decanter on the side table instead of responding right away. Don't make this weird, Father. I believe I'm allowed one sincere moment per decade. Fine, you've used it. Return to being terrifying immediately. Damien's mouth curved, faint but genuine, as you wish. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There had never really been a rift to reconcile, just the ordinary distance that grew between a busy father and a dutiful son over the years. But something settled between them that evening regardless, something that made the family they were building, strange, unconventional, thoroughly gossiped about across the entire capital, feel less like an accident and more like something worth having fought for. The wedding of Marquis Damien Thorncliffe and Elian Rosewood took place exactly 1 year later, and the Empire showed up in full scandalized force to witness it. Gossip about the event had reached near legendary status by the time the invitations went out. Half the noble attendees came out of pure curiosity. The other half came specifically to confirm, with their own eyes, that the terrifying Iron Wolf of the North genuinely, actually smiled. To their collective horror, he smiled the entire ceremony. At one point, he even laughed, an event so unprecedented that at least 2 elderly dukes reportedly required smelling salts. When it came time to exchange vows, Damien spoke first, his voice steady in a way that carried easily across the silent chapel. I spent most of my life believing I understood exactly what my future held: duty, distance, and quiet. I did not expect to be wrong about that. I did not expect you. He paused, and for a moment, the composed Marcus looked almost young. I promise to spend whatever years I have left making sure you never doubt that being wrong was the best thing that ever happened to me. Elian, who had sworn to himself he would not cry, promptly failed that promise within the first sentence. I came into this world with a plan, he said, voice thick. Stay quiet, stay out of the way, disappear before anyone noticed me. You noticed me in a garden I wasn't even supposed to be in, and you never once let me disappear again. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, laughing despite himself. So, I promise to keep getting lost in your gardens, if you promise to keep finding me. Always, Damien said, and the single word carried more weight than any speech could have. The officiant, visibly moved despite decades of presiding over noble weddings, cleared his throat and hurried through the remaining formalities before he, too, embarrassed himself in front of half the Empire's aristocracy. During the banquet, Elian raised his glass with theatrical solemnity. To Transmigration, he announced, for ruining my plans and giving me a mutt instead. Damien raised his own glass, eyes soft. To Fate. Cedric, seated nearby with a drink already halfway to his mouth, sighed and lifted his own glass in solidarity. To Therapy, he said, which I will absolutely be needing after this year. The hall erupted into laughter, loud enough to rattle the chandeliers. Later that evening, once the formal toasts had ended and the music had turned soft enough for actual conversation, Cedric found Elian standing alone near the garden doors, watching the dancing with a faraway look. Regrets? Cedric asked, settling in beside him, careful the way one might check on an old friend. None, Elian said, just thinking about how differently this could have gone. In the book, I disappear around chapter 40. No wedding, no garden. No ridiculous ledger the servants apparently kept on your father the entire time. You know about the ledger? The butler showed me. Under duress. I bribed him with the same strawberry tarts your father used to have smuggled in for me. Elian smiled, a little wistful. I used to think the safest plan was staying invisible. not fighting for anything, not wanting anything too loudly, just waiting for the story to be over so I could disappear quietly and call it a win. And now? Now I have the world's most intimidating father-in-law who cries at weddings, a former fiancé who's somehow become my best friend, and an entire household staff who apparently have a betting pool on our anniversary gifts. Elian shook his head, laughing softly. I think this worked out better than a quiet disappearance. Cedric bumped his shoulder against Elian's, more fondness in the gesture than either of them would have admitted a year ago. Back when they were still two strangers performing an engagement neither of them had chosen or wanted. For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't disappear. Even though I accidentally stole your father, especially because you accidentally stole my father, he needed someone exactly as stubborn as you to drag him out of that study. Cedric glanced across the garden to where Damien stood, watching them both with the same soft, unguarded expression he now wore constantly, as though he still couldn't quite believe his own life. He hasn't looked at anyone like that since my mother. I used to think I'd never see it again. Elian followed his gaze, and something warm settled in his chest at the sight of it, steady, certain, entirely unafraid. Guess the book got it wrong about me after all, he said. Turns out I wasn't cannon fodder. I was just reading the wrong chapter. Somewhere, if such things were possible, Damien's late wife was very likely laughing right along with them, because not even she, who had known him longest and best, could have predicted that her dignified, battle-hardened husband, a man feared by kings and generals alike, would one day become hopelessly, publicly, embarrassingly devoted to their son's former fiancé. And yet, despite the chaos, the gossip, and the sheer absurdity of everything that had led to this moment, one truth remained unshakable. The Iron Wolf of the North had finally lost a battle, the only one he'd never trained for, against an opponent he never saw coming. And judging by the way he smiled, holding Elian close as the last toast of the evening rang out across the hall, it was, without question, the happiest defeat of his entire life. Long after the last guests had gone home, and the musicians had packed away their instruments, the head butler sat alone in the servants' quarters with a small, worn notebook in hand, the very same ledger the Rose Appreciation Society had kept faithfully for over a year, documenting every smile, every stolen glance, every impossible act of devotion their once unshakable lord had committed in the name of love. He turned to the final page, and, with the same careful hand he'd used for every entry before it, wrote one last line beneath the record of the wedding. Case closed. Subject fully, happily, and permanently compromised. No regrets recorded. He closed the notebook, set it gently in a drawer he had no intention of ever opening again for official purposes, and allowed himself, for the first time in over a year of quiet, dedicated surveillance, a genuine and unguarded smile. Some battles, even the Iron Wolf of the North had never stood a chance of winning. This, the butler decided, watching the last of the garden lanterns flicker out through the window, had been the best possible outcome for absolutely everyone involved. Even if it had taken an accidental transmigration, one oblivious young noble, and an entire household's worth of second-hand heart palpitations to get there. He allowed himself one final thought before turning in for the night, that somewhere out there, in whatever strange place young Master Elian had come from, someone might one day wonder what became of a story they'd abandoned halfway through, never knowing that the minor character they'd given up on had, in the end, gotten the best ending of all. Down the corridor, in a bedroom lit only by dying candlelight, Elian lay curled against Damien's side, still half in his wedding clothes, too content to bother changing. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. "I was thinking," Damien said, voice low and unhurried, "that I spent most of my life certain I understood exactly what I wanted from it. Peace, order, a quiet legacy for my son to inherit. I never once imagined wanting this. Regrets? None," Damien said, echoing the word Elian had used earlier that very evening, and pressed a slow, unhurried kiss to the top of his head. "Only gratitude that a rather clumsy young man once got lost in my garden." Elian huffed a soft, sleepy laugh against his chest. "In my defense, 15 gardens really was an unreasonable number of gardens." "I've been meaning to plant a 16th, Damien said, "purely so you have an excuse to get lost again. You're impossible. You married me anyway." Elian smiled into the dark, utterly at peace in a life he'd never planned for and would not have traded for anything. "Best accident I ever made," he whispered, and let sleep finally claim them both. "This story stuck with us the whole time we were putting it together, so we're genuinely curious. Tell us in the comments which moment got you the most. We read every single one, and honestly, that's the whole reason we keep making these. If you'd like to see the next story land in your feed, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss it. Thank you for spending this time with us.